Okay, everyone, so for today's lesson, we're going to look at the election of 1928. Our objectives and standards: explain the role radio played in the election 1928, and analyze the campaign for president in the election 1928. And our standards are here again as well. Okay, so think about this. How do candidates use the media to get their message across? So obviously we just had a presidential election about a month or so ago. So how did those candidates use the media to get their message across, and how do you think that that may have differed from the election of 1928? And our essential question: what was the outcome of the election of 1928? Okay, so preview to the election. So President Calvin Coolidge announced that he would not run again for president. So this meant that the door was open for candidates to run for the office. So the Republicans are going to nominate Herbert Hoover, and you may recognize his name from in earlier lessons during World War I, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And the Democrats are going to nominate Alfred E Smith, or he was better known as Al E. Smith. So Herbert Hoover. So Herbert Hoover was a geologist and engineer, and he had done some work in those fields. He was also head of the U.S. Food Administration during World War I, which we had talked about him a little bit during World War I, a little bit with saving food and things like that, and victory gardens. He also served as Secretary of Commerce under Presidents Harding and President Coolidge. Okay, so Alfred Emanuel Smith, like I said, Allie Smith, he was a four-time governor of New York. Um, he had no real college education, but he had worked in different jobs and worked his way up through the political ranks. He'd been a sheriff, he'd been a city councilman, I believe. So he has some experience in the political realm. And he was also the first Roman Catholic nominee for president, which is kind of interesting. So the campaign. So a major issue of the campaign was the 18th Amendment, or prohibition. Smith was against it. He believed that it, caused a lot of crime and a lot of problems and did more harm than good in the country. While Hoover, now I have here that he supported it, but Hoover called it a noble cause, meaning that he thought it was a good idea and thought that maybe it could work out, but he also believed it would be very difficult to enforce. So I don't want you thinking that Hoover was on board for it 100%. He supported and thought that it was a good idea, but he also knew that it would be very difficult to enforce. Another interesting thing about the campaign was that the radio played a large role in the election for the first time. This is the first time that the radio had kind of um, been introduced during a presidential campaign, and we talked about this during the 1920s leisure lesson that a lot of Americans are using the radio and listening to the radio more often. So obviously people are going to listen to the speeches from these candidates and other candidates as well. Um, while Smith did well in person on the campaign trail, meaning like when he spoke to people face to face and shook their hands and things like that, he did very well. But Hoover was better at using the radio to campaign, so he was more efficient at getting his message across through the radio. So the results. So Herbert Hoover is going to win the election, a landslide victory. There's two main reasons for this. Well, actually, three main reasons. But one being on here that many were cautious of Smith because of his religion. Many people were afraid that because Smith was Roman Catholic that he might try to make American Roman Catholic. A lot of Americans were not in favor of that at this time. So many people were fearful of that. Another reason was that others wanted to continue the Republican agenda that had made the 1920s so prosperous. Remember, we had Warren Harding, who was president in the early 1920s and did some good with the country, making the country prosperous. And then we had Calvin Coolidge, who did a lot of good with businesses and things like that to make the country to continue to be prosperous. So a lot of Americans like what's going on, so they figure that they're going to keep Republican ideas and values going because it's doing a good job for the country. And then thirdly, you could consider that the radio also helped Herbert Hoover get his message across to different parts of the country that he may not be able to go to physically. So the radio also probably helped too, and because Hoover was better at using the radio and getting his message across that way, that probably definitely impacted his chances as well. And here's a map of the election results of 1928. You can see that down south a little bit is where Smith had made some gains, but mainly Herbert Hoover won the election, a landslide victory. Okay, so just to kind of wrap it up, the campaign of 1928, Hoover and Smith campaigned on prohibition and used the radio to get their message across. And the results, like I said, Hoover won in a landslide victory. So that's all I have for this lesson. So I will talk to you soon or see you in class.